Okay, seems to have settled down a little bit. So welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar. Really excited to get going today and dive into what's going to be a really fascinating topic and a hugely important one. So for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do by now, my name is Rick. I'm CEO of the rare disease charity Findacure. We're here today for this webinar to focus on the crucial topic of measuring quality of life. And really pleased to say that today we'll be doing this webinar in collaboration with Healx, who've been helping us to put this together and help give us a really excellent panel of speakers to dive into this topic. So let's make sure I can advance my slide. And first up, before we start, it's always good to make sure everyone knows who we are. Again, most of you are familiar with Findacure by now, I'm sure, but for those that aren't, we are a UK rare disease charity that's really trying to drive a development of the rare disease community to hopefully develop far more treatments for rare diseases and make a real difference in the field. Our vision, therefore, is a world in which all rare diseases have treatments that have been made together with patients for patients. And it's something we're trying to work towards every day. What we do then to do that really comes down to that classic buzzword of empowerment. We want to try and help patient groups to form, grow and professionalise. And a core part of the work that we're doing is through our patient group empowerment programme, within which we deliver webinars much like this one. We want to try and help organisations to grow, to form. We want to help groups like you find ways to better support your patient groups and the families that you're working for on a daily basis. Crucially as well, we want to help you find ways to get ready to be involved in research and really deliver that huge impact that patient can bring into your rare disease area. And of course, with the disease being rare, you need to find ways to raise awareness wherever you can, and hopefully some of the trainings we provide can help you do that. And these are delivered in a range of different formats, whether that's a webinar where you sit and listen, a workshop where we're going to try and drive you towards face-to-face interaction, or at least digital interaction these days, online e-learning resources, or a kind of peer support, one-on-one training through our mentoring program. Today in a webinar format, so we're using the Zoom webinar platform, which hopefully many of you are familiar with over the last year and a half of isolation. What you can see at the bottom of your screens is a lovely control panel, which gives you some of the basic tools you need to interact with us. Obviously, there's a raise hand function, which you can use if you want to raise awareness, but generally in our webinars, it's best to use our chat and Q&A function. It's going to interact with you using type. Chat is there to help you let us know if you've got any technical difficulties, if you can't hear, or you want to participate with some of the team that are behind the scenes coordinating with coordinating the webinar, or to interact with one another. If you've got a question though, please try and use the Q&A box. The Q&A box is a really nice function in webinars that allows you guys to begin to upvote questions and actually to tell us what questions the audience really wants to hear. So here's a little screenshot of what the Q&A box can do. Here you can see some very insightful questions I posed a while back, but you can see a plus, a big thumbs up sign. Use that to upvote and tell us you really want to hear the answer to that question. From here, we can also answer these questions live, or any of our panelists can type answers to you to make sure you get the information you require. And you should be able to see open questions or those that have been answered. So do look at that and keep an eye on it throughout the webinar itself. Finally, we're always trying to use Zoom subtitles wherever we can to increase the accessibility and your ability to understand what's going on in the webinar. So if you want to enable the live transcripts or the subtitles, you can do that yourself through the Zoom panel. So feel free to do that. If it's something you don't want to have, you can also turn it off very easily too. So hopefully this increases accessibility for you guys watching the webinar today. Okay, so I'm going to give a very brief introduction to why we should focus on quality of life, why we're here today. It's obviously a hugely important growing area. I think what we've seen, and I'm really positive to see over the last few years, is far more attention to patient engagement in research and to patient engagement at every stage of the drug development process. But an area where we're seeing and have seen for a while lots of engagement is obviously in the decision-making process about whether drugs should be reimbursed and brought to market. And at that stage of the decision-making process, the HTA process, the crucial question that's been asked is, if we're paying for this drug, are we really getting value for it? How do we understand what impact this treatment, this intervention is going to have on that patient population? Does the fact that we saw a change in this biomarker really make a difference to patients? And that's where these quality of life measures can really make a huge difference. They're tools that can give us a clear way, a powerful way to demonstrate the value of intervention to a patient population or an individual, to really show the impact it has on the daily life of that individual, to be able to walk a few steps further, or be able to have increased movement in their hands, or to be able to improve their visibility. These are the things that show well, this makes an impact on someone's day-to-day life. And that's what we want to try and capture when we're building tools to measure quality of life. And of course, one of the big challenges in rare conditions and with some of the other quality of life tools is the way it's measured in generic tools that work for a broad range of diseases might not fully encompass the things that matter to our particular patient population. And what we want to try and do is have tools that can really show and reveal the true impact of a treatment or condition. And that's why we're beginning to see in a number of different cases, disease areas, groups working towards developing tools to measure the quality of life that really matters to their patient population and their disease. And these disease-specific measures are quite a powerful tool to really demonstrate what can happen in your area, but also hard to approach, hard to develop, and an area we want to see increasingly developing over the next few years. And hopefully in today's webinar, we'll hear about how you can go about doing that. So I'm really excited to see what we discussed today. And please do share your questions throughout the discussion so we can make sure we get the best of our excellent panel of experts. And that panel is shown here and obviously on camera as well. Really pleased to have them here today. So throughout the webinar, we're going to hear from these 4 speakers in 2 distinct talks. First up, we have Dr. John Brazier, who's Professor of Health Economics at the School of Health and Related Research at the University of Sheffield. And John's going to be speaking alongside Jill Carlton, who's his colleague there. And these guys are going to be diving into the design and validation of quality of life instruments. And then I'm really pleased to have both Yvette Venable and Mel Whittington, who are joining us from ICER in the US to give some insights in how you can incorporate utilities into the kind of US value assessment process. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that fits there and how the 2 different perspectives come together. So thank you to our speakers for joining us today. It's going to be really interesting to hear your perspectives. And this is a rough outline of the schedule for you all as well. What we can see is you've just heard from me and hopefully enjoyed it greatly. And then I'm going to be quiet and let the real experts speak. We're passing over shortly to Jill and John, who can dive into their topic of designing and validating these quality of life instruments and really how you get started on this journey. Something that's really crucial for the patient community to dive into, and we're excited to see what they can do. And then, as I said, passing on to Yvette and Mel, really looking at how we're assessing value in the US and incorporating these utilities into the area. Plenty of time at the end for your questions. If the pertinent questions are coming up, I'm going to introduce them at the end of each talk, and we're going to really build through, hopefully, to the chance for you to ask our experts as much as you want to know about this topic towards the end of the day. So that's it from me. So with that, I'm really excited to hear what comes along today, and I'm very pleased to hand over to our first speakers. So John and Jill, welcome, and please do take it away.
We're going to be talking a little bit today about how we go about developing quality of life instruments or questionnaires, and about how really to work with people like yourselves to make sure that we are developing questionnaires that are important to the people with that lived condition, and the data therefore that we collect is important and meaningful to people who make decisions around which healthcare to fund. So we're going to start off with a bit about, well, what is quality of life and why should we even measure it? And Rick's already touched upon this in his introduction. So quality of life is very much a subjective experience. So it can include the impact a health condition has upon somebody's ability to do things in a physical sense. But it also, living with any health condition does have other impacts as well, such as our emotions, our feelings, the psychological impact, but also around our social functioning and our well-being. Seamless start. So as I was saying, when we kind of think about quality of life, we're thinking really about how somebody's health condition impacts upon all areas of their life in terms of their relationships with other people, how it impacts upon their feelings and emotions, but also about what impacts there may be in terms of their physical abilities to do things such as daily activities. And it's really important that we have an assessment of the impact of all of these so that we can value those benefits that a new treatment or a new intervention can bring to the individual. And HTA agencies definitely require this information when they're doing their economic evaluations. And we'll hear more about that later on in the webinar from our colleagues at ICER. Next slide. So there are a number of stages in which we go through when we're developing quality of life questionnaires, and we've kind of broken these down into sort of 5 key areas. The first one is really, do we need a new questionnaire in the first place? The stages 2 and 3 are around developing and subsequently refining a questionnaire. Stage 4 is around providing evidence to show that the new questionnaire has merit to it, and also that it performs well. And stage 5 is where we're finding out about the relative importance of the components within that questionnaire, such that we can get utility weights that can be used for these economic evaluations and subsequent modelling. So what we're going to do now is, over the next few slides, is go through each of those stages in a little bit more detail and think about how people in charities and patient group advocates can help inform and work with us as researchers to make sure that we're really capturing what's important to people with that lived experience. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the first stage for us is to establish if there's even a need to develop a new instrument. If there is an instrument out there which already works well, it's already measuring what it is that's important to the individual, then there really is no need to develop a new questionnaire. So it's important that we make that assessment, not least because we don't want to have lots and lots of instruments out there such that researchers and clinical academics are confused about which instrument to use, but we also need to think about any potential burden in terms of research waste. So that evaluation of existing questionnaires, of existing patient-reported outcomes is really quite crucial. Now, the assessment can take part in a number of different ways. So we can do a formal assessment of how each of these patient-reported outcomes or quality of life questionnaires perform. And there is recognised methodology of how to do that. And the acronym there, the COSMIN, is a recognised approach of doing that. COSMIN, to a degree, incorporates consultation with patient, public involvement and engagement experts. But we feel that this is a really crucial component in determining the suitability of existing questionnaires and indeed quality of life questionnaires. So myself and very much within our team, we're really committed to consulting with people with that lived experience to assess one really key area, which is that area of content validity. And what do we mean by that? Well, we're wanting to look at the questionnaire in more detail. Are the questions within it relevant to the target population? So are they relevant to people who would be filling it in? Does it include questions that measure and ask about all the different ways in which living with that health condition impacts upon an individual's quality of life? And is it understandable to the person filling it in? Because if it's not understandable, then the data that you obtain from using that questionnaire could in itself be questioned. So that's one aspect that we look at. What is missing within that component also is around acceptability. So a questionnaire might have very, very good content validity, but it might have 200 questions within it. And so in terms of acceptability to the user, to acceptability to the person who might be completing it, I would anticipate that that is very low. I certainly wouldn't like to be filling in a questionnaire with over 200 questions within it. So you can see here that within this stage 1, there is a real opportunity for patient groups and patient and public involvement advocates to work with researchers within that assessment of, is there a need to develop a new questionnaire, a new quality of life measure. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an example of some work that we've undertaken within our unit, which were some work that we took as part of Project Hercules, which was a project really driven by the Duchenne UK, which is a charity for the Duchenne community. Next slide, please. Duchenne UK asked us to look at what the themes, all the different ways in which living with Duchenne can impact upon an individual's quality of life. So we did a systematic review and we looked at the evidence that is published out there to find out all the different ways that living with Duchenne can impact upon an individual. And then they subsequently asked us to look at all the different instruments that had been used to assess quality of life within that population, to find out how fit for purpose they were. And so there's some examples of this in real life. And indeed, within that second publication that's listed there, we did work with the Duchenne community such that they assessed the relevance and the comprehensiveness and the comprehensibility of those quality of life questionnaires that we identified. Next slide, please. So let's say that there is a need to develop a new questionnaire, a new quality of life questionnaire. How do we go about it? Well, stages 2 and 3 really sum up the beginning of that, really. So it's very, very important for us to understand as researchers what it is like to live with that health condition. And yes, I can read about it in a textbook and I can talk to clinicians, but who really knows about it? It's the people who live with that health condition. So it's very important for us to talk to individuals to really get an understanding of all the different ways and living with that health condition impacts upon them. And obviously there's variation within that, depending upon the age of a person, depending upon other factors as well, other characteristics. So we undertake normally a wide number, a number of interviews across a wide spectrum to ensure that we're picking up all the possible important things for us to consider to include within our questionnaire. Now, in some cases, of course, we can't interview people because they may not be of an age which is appropriate to interview somebody. I've tried to interview children who are 5 and it's often not very productive. And sometimes there might be other issues around interviewing the individual. So sometimes we do interview parents and sometimes we interview carers, but wherever possible, we like to hear directly from the individual. So from those interviews, we collect an awful lot of data, this qualitative data, this rich description, and we analyze that using a conceptual framework. And we think about all the different ways and identify all these different themes in which that health condition impacts upon somebody's quality of life. So some will be related to physical activities, some will be related to sort of feelings and emotions, and some will be related to sort of social activities and social functioning. And then from there, what we do is develop a big list of draft questions that cover all of those themes and sub-themes that we've identified through our interviews. Next slide, please. And again, I'll give you another example here where we've worked with the Duchenne community in developing this questionnaire that measures quality of life, the DMD qual. Next slide, please. So in developing the DMD qual, we undertook some interviews with boys and men who live with Duchenne. And we analysed that data and we found there were sort of 7 broad themes, which are shown on the slide there, that they found, and they described the ways in which Duchenne impacted upon them. And there were some sub-themes within those as well, of course. So we use that qualitative evidence along with some other decision rules which we can apply to produce a big long list of questions that we could include within this draft questionnaire that we were developing. So it's a bit like that phrase, there's many ways in which you can skin a cat. So there's many different ways in which we can ask about the same thing, which is why we've got 43 questions in that draft questionnaire and 7 themes overall displayed on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. So we've got those 43 draft questions and we kind of think, well, okay, some of those questions might be asking about the same thing. Maybe we're not asking them in exactly the same way. So let's test it, let's refine it. And indeed, that is what happens in stage 3. So what we do here is some cognitive interviews, some exercises, again, with people who live with the target condition, and in some cases as well with healthcare professionals to get their feedback. And of course, where relevant, speaking to parents and carers. This allows us to identify any of the draft questions that may not work very well. And what I mean by that is they may be sensitive to ask and people may express a reluctance. For example, if I saw that on a questionnaire, I wouldn't be happy with filling that in. I would leave that out. And if that's the case, is that an important thing that we should be including within the questionnaire in the first instance? It allows us to test a number of components this phase in stage 3. So we can check out how well our instructions work in terms of providing people information about how to complete the draft questionnaire. It allows us to refine the wording of the questions that we've generated. It allows us to get rid of some, and it also allows us another opportunity to add in anything that we may have missed. It allows us to think about how we're asking the questions. So are we asking about how often something might happen? Or are we asking about how bad something is when it does happen? So thinking about frequency versus severity. And it's also important for us to think about how many choices that people have. Too many choices can be problematic, and too few might not really give us the level of information that we require. And finally, it allows us to also think about that recall period. And each quality of life questionnaire can have a different recall period. Some questionnaires ask about, I'd like you to think about your life in the last 7 days. Some ask about how you feel today, and some ask about how you might have felt in the last month. So this stage 3 of refining the draft questionnaire allows us to test all of these little things out, again, with people with that lived experience. So it is important for us to do, but what we do here is with a much smaller number of people compared to that which I described in stage 2. Next slide, please. So again, giving you a bit of an example with regards to the DMD qual. Next slide. What we did then was take it into testing how well it worked on a more quantitative level, so on a survey level. So we then include all those draft questions within the questionnaire, but we also add in some other quality of life questionnaires. And what we want to do is to see how our new thing compares to existing ones, and have we got any evidence to show that our new thing works better than the other. So we undertake some statistical analysis to find out which of the questions, those draft questions that we've included, work the best. And there's a number of different ways in which we can do that, using a number of different analytical techniques, which I won't get into in this webinar today. And we use the results of both this stage of stage 4, but also really importantly, the results of stage 3 to help us determine which questions are included in the final questionnaire, but also which response choices we might use. Next slide, please. So again, to give you a bit of an example. So I'm talking again here about the DMD qual. So on the top of the slide there, on the left-hand side, we've got the qualitative data. So that's really talking about stage 2, and stage 2 drives all the development of the questionnaires, or the questions within it rather, which is what we call the item pool. And then you can see on the right-hand side, we've got this cognitive debriefing phase, which then feeds into revising this item set. So revising these questions that we might include. And then on the left-hand side again, we have the results of stage 4, this quantitative analysis to find out which questions perform the best. And we use that information along with other bits, which is shown on the slide there, to determine which questions we should include within that final questionnaire. And most importantly, I'd like to point out on the bottom left-hand side here, that stakeholder consultation. Now, throughout this whole process, obviously you've seen that we are talking to people with that lived experience. We're gathering data from people who live with that health condition. But where patient and public involvement groups can really help us within stages 2, 3, and 4 is to give their views on, well, I think this should be included, or I really don't see the importance of that question. I wouldn't be happy answering that question. So this is where groups can work with us as researchers, and really we view that very much as a partnership, and that's certainly what we did when we developed the DMD qual, and it's certainly a technique that is really embedded within all the work that we do within the unit that I work in. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over to John now, who's going to talk about the final stage of this development. John.
Thanks very much, Jill. So I'm going to just say a bit about this idea of preference weighting and why we do it. Not all questionnaires have this done, but we think it's important in this area with rare diseases that we do go this extra step. And the reason is, as Jill has already said, that HTA agencies like NICE, for example, in the UK, and similar agencies around the world, many of them require, when a new treatment is being considered, they require information on what's called the cost per quality in order to decide whether the new treatment, whether they should recommend that the new treatment is made available. And now in the UK, it's the NHS, but in other countries, obviously it will be the local health system. And the cost per quality is some way of looking at the value. Is it good value, value for money? Now, the QALY, or the quality adjusted life here, I'm sure some of you know about this, or at least have heard about it, but I thought I'd just at least give you a bit of a description. And you can see from the figure on this slide, two profiles of health, A and B. And the way we're describing health is across two dimensions. One is how long somebody lives, and the other one is the quality of that life, or health-related quality, as it's usually called in the field. And basically, we're ascribing a value to somebody's quality of life between 0 and 1, where 1 is for good health, perfect health, and dead is a state that's so bad that it's regarded as bad as being dead. I have to say there aren't many people in states like that. You'll be glad to hear, but they do exist. And this can also be done, this is also useful, getting these preference weights, is it also provides us a way of scoring an instrument like the DMD qual in a way that reflects how important the different aspects of quality of life are. Next slide, please, Ray. So somebody has mentioned in the Q&A something about why not use generic measures for this purpose. This is measures that have been produced for all patient groups, not just one patient group. And there's quite a lot of these general or generic measures around. Sandra mentioned the WHO qual, but one that's much more commonly used in HTA, health technology assessment, is something called the EQ5D, sometimes called the Euroqual. And this has 5 core dimensions of health: mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain, discomfort, anxiety, and depression. And under each of these, there are 5 levels of how well or badly you're doing, if you like, against each of these. Now, as you can probably see, this for some conditions may be fine, and some common conditions actually are described quite well by this system. But there are other conditions, and this is answering the question that Sandra raised, where we're not satisfied that this instrument adequately describes the way that a person's condition impacts on their quality of life. Obviously, no instrument's perfect, but from the sort of reviews, undertaking reviews of the kind that Jill described, we can look more closely at whether we think, in this case, for example, these 5 domains actually do cover the ways in which a particular condition impacts on people's lives. Next slide, please. Now, to move from a quality of life instrument like the DMD qual to something which has preference weights, there's a number of stages or steps that you need to go through. And this is sort of work that we've done quite a lot in SHA over the years, including with the DMD qual. And basically, step 1 is to check the dimensionality, that the dimensions make sense. Obviously, in the case of Jill's instrument, we know that's going to be the case, so that we'll pass quickly on from that step. But the next step is to reduce down the measure, because typically these sorts of instruments are too large for generating preference weights or preference scores. So we have to be more selective about the items that we go forward with. And so we go through this item selection process. Having selected a smaller number of items, we then conduct a valuation survey. And this is a survey where essentially we ask people in various ways to provide us with weights or values for the different dimensions of quality of life. And there's a variety of methods, which I won't go into, but things like time trade-off, discrete choice experiments, and so on. Obviously, a big question is who we ask, who we get these values from. Now, in this work, typically we go to the general population because that's what HTA agencies like, because they see the general population as having some sort of democratic credibility, I suppose. But there's also, I think, increasing interest in asking patients or representative of patients to provide those values. So next slide, please. So I'm going to take the example of the DMD coil and just show you how there's a sort of an extra step added in when you derive preference weights. So the first one is to reduce a bit further down the item set. And then obviously the other thing we want to make sure is that the item set we have describes health in a way that is going to be suitable for some of the valuation exercises that we take people through. Next slide, please. So here's an example of of where we've taken the DMD coil, reduced it down in this case to just eight aspects, 8 dimensions. The EQ5D had 5, we have 8 here. And you can see the kind of things that for Duchenne's that we've included and how they differ from the EQ5D. So as well as mobility, we include difficulties using hands, breathing, tiredness, worry, participation, which is a very important aspect of quality of life for people in this condition, as well as general feelings about yourself. And for each of these domains, we have one item, whereas in the bigger instruments, sometimes there's more than one item, often there is more than one item. And also we have different responses or levels attached to each of those items that we ask people to fill out for us. So next slide. So here's a slide that gives you an idea about what comes out of this, which is that for each of the dimensions, you've got the dimensions along the top, there are multiple levels. And in this case, we have 4 levels for each dimension. So if we took the mobility dimension, if you're at level 1, then you're fine and you score, you'll remain with a score of 1. But if you're at level 2 of mobility, that is, you have some problems with mobility, then the way the scoring works is we take off 0.05 from the score of 1 to give you 0.95 to represent the loss of quality of life, if you like, from that mobility problem. As you can see, if you have mobility 3 or 4, the amount we're taking off is much bigger. It's 0.2. And if you work your eye along there, you can see that pain has the highest sort of weights, which is perhaps not surprising. So does feeling good, whereas tiredness has much lower weights. So according to the population that we got these values from, we're able to derive these scores, if you like, for different responses to the questionnaire. So that wraps up all I was going to say about this final stage of developing quality of life instruments. And I'll just hand over to Jill now, just to end, just to sum up and leave us with some interesting questions. Over to you,
Thanks,
Jill.
John. So there are undoubtedly some challenges in developing quality of life questionnaires, and indeed questionnaires with those utility weights associated with them. But I think the important thing to acknowledge here is that there are some additional challenges when we think about conditions which are rare. And there are many, many different rare diseases out there. But we really need to think about the people who live with those health conditions. And as somebody has pointed out in the Q&A section, is that it can be very challenging to recruit people to studies such as these. If these conditions are so rare, how do we get sufficient data, sufficient numbers in order to be able to conduct these steps? And indeed, that is a real challenge when we are developing questionnaires, quality of life questionnaires around conditions such as asthma, for example, we don't face those kinds of issues. I think it's really important as well to acknowledge that people who live with a rare condition sometimes can feel that they are already research saturated, that they may already be asked to take part in a number of trials, to be interviewed about what it's like to live with that health condition. And they may feel, do you know what, as interesting as this is, I've got enough on my plate right now. This is not something that I wish to help with. So recruitment can be a real problem here, and this is where working with charities and patient advocacy groups can certainly help us as researchers, because we can work together in conjunction to kind of demonstrate that we can work collaboratively, but also that as researchers we're able to work around the challenges that people face in life. We can collect data at weekends, we can talk to people after school, we can talk to people after work, such that we can sort of maximise recruitment. But it is an acknowledged challenge when we think about the rare disease space. Traditional methods, without doubt, do require large numbers. So some of our analyses, just the addition of 5 or 10 more participants into our study might make an awful lot of difference. So it is important for us to think about that very carefully. And finally, if we are going to develop a quality of life questionnaire, which is specific to each of these rare diseases that are out there, or these rare health conditions that are out there, we do have to sort of think about how accepting HTA agencies might be around this evidence, and may have to provide a very strong rationale as to why we don't use something, for example, like the EQ5D or the Healx. I think that is us now, Rick. I'm very aware that we've probably rabbited on over time as well, sorry.
Guys, thank you so much. You are almost bang on at the end of our 30-minute slot, which is fantastic and really appreciated. Sorry the screen share wasn't working, but I think that ran through quite smoothly. I can see loads of questions that are happening and lots going in the chat as well, which is brilliant. And we're going to dive into most of those questions, I think, in the session at the end, once we've had our next speaker. I think briefly, I just wanted to pick up on that point you touched on at the end there, Jill, around that acceptance in HTA agencies, and what have you guys seen, or what can the community more broadly do to help encourage the acceptance of some of these more bespoke tools as they're being developed, and are you seeing any trends towards that them being more ready to accept these types of things? I think it's quite an interesting point just to delve into a touch more.
So Jan might have a differing perspective for myself. So I've never been involved with a submission to a HTA agency. However, I have worked with for some charities where we have undertaken some work for them in order to be able to demonstrate that some generic quality of life questionnaires don't fully reflect all the ways in which that rare condition impacts upon the individual. And that might either be on the individual themselves, or indeed the wider family unit in the case of some of these rare conditions where it impacts upon a child. So I think there's a real space there for patient advocacy groups to drive some good qualitative research to say, for example, the EQ5D or the Healx or the SF36, that is not my life. This is missing, that's missing, this is missing. So I would say that that's an area in which the rare disease community can work together to say, hang on a minute, this isn't me. I'm not sure what John feels about that though, because he's probably had much more experience.
No, I completely agree with what you're saying, Jill. I mean, my experience with NICE, and they're currently, as you may know, been reviewing the methods, is that they take quite a conservative line in the sense that they know the EQ5D and that's what they like to see. So you're always pushing against that. So in a sense, the onus is on you submitting, making the case about why your condition is different to others, in a sense, and why a generic instrument, a general instrument like EQ5D, as Jill says, is not appropriate in reflecting the impact of a condition. And no instrument's going to be perfect, so you've got to be making quite a strong case. It's not just one or two things that aren't reflected, it's that this is fundamental to the condition in some way, or the way the condition impacts on people's lives.
Brilliant. Guys, thank you for answering that. I really appreciate it. And I think that's definitely a point we'd like to come back to in discussion at the end. For now, thank you for a great talk and a really great dive into how you go about doing this. I'm excited to tease some more parts of that out a little bit later. So thank you both. At this point then, I'd like to welcome Mel Whittington to the stage along with Yvette Venable, both from ICR in the US, and they're going to dive into their presentation and give them insights into how you think about utilities and value in the US. So welcome both, and thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you so much. You can see it, okay, because I'm still getting that weird green box, but as long as you can see it, we're all good. Thank you very much for having us today. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to all of you today. I'm Yvette Venable, no S. I know the Brits do like to append an S to the end of my name, but I'm not related to Terry Venables, the football coach. But I am the Vice President of Patient Engagement for ICER, and my role is to really ensure that we are forging strong relationships with patient advocates to ensure that they can contribute to our reports and really partner with us on our research. I'm joined today by our Deputy Head of Health Economics, Mel Whittington, who's going to be able to share all the technical nitty-gritty of how we look at utility measures and incorporate that into our assessment. So our presentation today, we're just going to very quickly introduce you to who we are as ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. We'll provide an overview of how we assess value and look specifically at those quality of life measures and how we incorporate them into our report. And then we'd like to discuss a little bit more about how we approach working with the patient community to ensure that our reports really reflect your experiences on quality of life and the lived experience of varying conditions. So just very quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a US-based health technology assessment group. We were inspired to be founded more than 15 years ago based on the work that NICE in the UK has done. But we have some very specific differences that adapt our work for the cultural and economic context of the US healthcare system. So we really are focused on trying to take those conversations that happen between manufacturers and our health insurers and payers, kind of take those conversations into the public domain to better understand what a fair price should look like based on the value that these new treatments provide to patients. And by doing that and agreeing what a fair price could look like, we then hope to ensure that coverage policies that the insurers use to govern access to medicines are fair, and that ecosystem preserves a culture where innovation continues to thrive in our country. So we're all about using that evidence in a transparent way. Our work is deeply rooted in an academic process, but we also believe very strongly that our work is much better when we involve patients very early on and partner with them throughout the entire time. Ultimately, what we are hoping is that our desire to have a healthcare system in balance is very much what patients want in terms of being able to have a choice of treatments available so that they and their healthcare team can find the one that works best for them. Next slide. So we are not a government agency. We are a nonprofit organization. So the majority of our funding comes from other large nonprofit foundations that have an interest in supporting better understanding of value-based pricing. We do have a small membership program that life science and payers and insurance companies contribute to that generates different policy white papers per year, but all of our core research work on their drug reviews is within the nonprofit foundation part of this. So there's no influence of the industry or insurers on the work that we're doing. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Mel, and she's going to start to get into the nitty-gritty of how we do our work here in the US.
Thanks, Yvette. We can go on to the next slide. As Yvette's mentioned, our work is taking this population level approach. And so we are looking at population level coverage and reimbursement decision making, not our individual patient and provider decision making. We're lucky to live in an age where there are numerous value assessment frameworks. ICER is one of them for the population and patient decision making, but we live in this ecosystem of numerous. The purpose of what I hope to contribute to this presentation is to take the work that Jill and John set up related to utilities and quality of life and preferences, and talk about first, what does that mean for a cost effectiveness analysis? And then specifically, how does ICER incorporate utilities into their cost effectiveness analyses? And so before I get into that second part about ICER and its use of utilities, I just wanted to do some really basic foundational utility and cost effectiveness talk that'll bridge the work that Jill and John presented with the latter part of my talk. And that is like, what the heck is a utility? What's the difference between a utility and quality of life, a preference? These are all terms that are thrown around and they mean something a little bit different. So utilities, if you look in like some health economics textbook, it's going to say utilities are values that represent the strength of an individual's preferences for a health-related outcome. It's essentially a preference score. It ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 might be indicative of death and 1 might be indicative of perfect health. And so it's an individual's preference for some health state on this range from 0 to 1. And so how is it used in a cost effectiveness analysis? We've all heard of this metric called the QALY, or the quality adjusted life year. And what the heck is a QALY? A QALY takes us, tells us what our survival is. What are our life years looking like in some disease condition with some treatment? How many life years are gained or result? That isn't as hard to wrap our head around. We can tangibly count life years. But what the preference weight does, or what utilities do, is utilities then weight those life years based on a patient's preferences. And so, as John illustrated on one of his latter slides, a more extreme level of pain has a lower utility, a larger disutility, than a lower pain metric. And so what the QALY can encompass is our life years gained, but also the preferences for the health states that make up those life years. So it's a way for us to account for the quantity of life years, but also the quality of life years, where that quality is informed by preferences. So the QALY combines our utilities, which is just a measure of our preferences, with those life years into this single metric. Next slide. So measuring utilities, how do we measure utilities? And I say we there, not as we of ICER, but we as every single person on this call, we as a society, we as people who care about improving lives through health and informing healthcare decision-making. How do we measure utilities? And there are numerous ways, and Jill and John provided a fantastic illustration of one approach to do this. And I think we've all appreciated even more so after this webinar how in-depth and intense and rigorous this work is. But there are direct methods to measure utilities. You might have heard of the words standard gamble or time trade-off or a visual analog scale. And these direct methods work with individuals and do these kind of little choice experiments. So for example, for a standard gamble approach, individuals might be presented with a choice between two alternatives. For example, a health state that is certain, maybe frequent migraine attacks. And then this gamble with one better health state, maybe full perfect health, and one worse health state, maybe death, sudden death. And so that respondent has to make these choices. And then there's math and probabilities that goes into, all right, taking that choice, what is the utility for that health state, that's that frequent migraine attack health state? And so there's these direct methods that are typically based on these choice experiments that works with that involves people to ask them how, what is our preference for this certain health state? And that's how you derive a utility, using these direct methods. There are also these indirect methods, which are more the primary focus of this webinar today. And that is this conversation that's already really heated up in the Q&A, which has been really fun to follow. And I think Jill and John did an awesome job setting that up and folding in some of that. But there's these generic preference instruments, these disease-specific preference measures, and then this possibility to map a disease-specific quality of life instrument to a generic preference instrument. And so there are three different methods, all of which are possible, all of which are rigorous, all have their strengths and benefits. So a generic preference instrument, this is like our EQ5D, the SF6, the HUI. We've probably heard of some of these. What these instruments are is it's a set of non-disease specific health states. And John showed us this, what the EQ5D looks like in one of his slides. But it's all based on these general attributes. But then they've been valued, that step 5 of Jill and John's presentation, they've been valued by this general public sample to be able to get this scoring algorithm. And that scoring algorithm is an essential, not an essential step, but a huge step in changing this from a quality of life score to a preference weight. And so for each instrument, the public values a limited number of health states. In a generic preference instrument, these are generic health states. And then the scoring algorithm is developed. So when you provide this survey to respondents, maybe as part of a clinical trial or part of an observational study, the individuals can complete this relatively simple questionnaire, but then their responses are then used in this scoring algorithm that has been developed outside of that exercise. The EQ5D, since we've used that as an example throughout this talk, they use the time trade-off method of directly eliciting the utilities. So this is a huge effort. A huge effort has gone into the development of these generic preference instruments to be able to create this standard instrument that can be sent to individuals and have that filled out in a matter of minutes and then linked back to a utility preference weight. There's also disease-specific preference measures, and that's something that Jill and John illustrated today, is where you have a disease-specific health-related quality of life instrument. So just like our generic instrument that use generic health states, the disease-specific is going to have disease-specific health states. And then the same exercise of the scoring algorithm is conducted. And so again, a substantial amount of science goes into this. These are very rigorous instruments. I would say disease-specific preference measures are less common because it is a lot of work. They are resource intensive and they are specific to that disease. So the third option for indirectly measuring these utilities is mapping a disease-specific quality of life instrument to a generic preference instrument like the EQ5D. And so how this works is you have a disease-specific quality of life instrument, and then that is mapped to a generic preference instrument like an EQ5D. There are some mappings available for some disease-specific quality of life instruments. But the obvious advantage of the bottom two bullets, the disease-specific preference measures and the mapping, is that it addresses some of the limitations of generic preference instruments and that they might not be as specific or as responsive as we would like. Next slide. All right, so now I want to talk about how ICER uses utilities. And this is a screenshot of our reference case. It's available on our website, but it's really designed to encourage consistency in the analytic approaches and modeling, but also to transparently specify our approach to modeling. And within that, it talks about where we get utility data from, what our recommendations are using utilities for. And I think it's important to note here, we as ICER, we don't do the work that Jill and John were illustrating. Many stakeholders outside of us generate those utility weights, and then we use them either from literature or from trials. We use them in our work. So as ICER as an institution, we aren't disseminating these instruments or creating these instruments, but we are using their outputs from them. Next slide. So what does our reference case say about utilities? Cost utility analysis, which is a cost effectiveness analysis that uses that quality adjusted life year as the outcome, is the default choice of analysis for ICER's reference case. The health state preferences or utilities should reflect those of the general US population. And John alluded to this as well. And the reason for this is relatively common among other HTA organizations, is that the ICER models and the ICER results primarily inform decisions at that population level, at the US population level, that involve individuals both with and without the condition or focus. Now, when that's not available, when health state preferences are not available from the general US population, that's when different populations can be used, which may include patients with the condition, patients affected by similar symptoms, proxy respondents, a host of other possibilities. Also stated in our reference case is that use of generic preference-based measures for utility values are recommended with the EQ5D preferred. And why is that? The EQ5D is the most widely used generic instrument. It's been extremely rigorously designed and tested, and it promotes comparability across studies and reviews. However, we know there are limitations to generic preference-based measures. And so it is stated in our reference case to use disease-specific preference-based data if generic are not responsive enough to distinguish those relevant health states or treatment attributes, or if generic preference data aren't available. Next slide. It's also very important for us to be extremely transparent in how we are using utilities and where we are getting those utilities from. If we are using disease-specific quality of life data, we also want to specify how was that information turned into a preference-based utility. Was this using statistical techniques to map it to a generic instrument? Or were we directly eliciting, or was a source that originated from this directly eliciting utilities based on a disease-specific instrument? So we do want to be very transparent in our reports where our utilities are coming from, and then how those utilities were developed. Was this direct elicitation? Was this indirect elicitation? And if it was indirect elicitation, was this a generic instrument, a disease-specific instrument? And if it was a disease-specific instrument, how are preference weights retrieved from that? Were they actually directly elicited based on that disease-specific instrument, or were they mapped to a generic instrument? Next slide. So there's been some really great chatter in the Q&A, and that I think are fascinating areas and needs for additional utility research and additional work. The first one being utility measurements directly from disease-specific instruments. And that's the work that Jill and John are doing of going beyond the generic preference-based instruments and developing disease-specific instruments. There's a lot of work that can be done there. Bullet number 2 is responsiveness of generic versus disease-specific instruments, even across different treatment effect ranges. And so there was a wonderful question in the Q&A about, are generic preference instruments responsive enough for rare diseases? And that's a fabulous question, and something that should be tested. And there's additional work that could be done there. Also generating utilities for not only the disease state at large, but within gradations of the disease. This is an area of utility research that's particularly interested me as a large gap that that still exists. Next slide. And the last thing I'll talk about before turning back over to Yvette is the need to fine-tune utilities. Utilities, how they are developed, very rigorous science, very important science, but they're still imprecise. They will not get us 100% of the way to what we really want to measure, and that's the net health benefit and what matters to patients. Now, do they get us in the right ballpark? I think they can. I think they're a great metric. They can serve as a preference weight for our quality adjusted life year metric. They have many other applications. I do think they could get us in the right ballpark, but we have to remember they're not perfect. And so further fine tuning may be needed. And that can occur in that utility into the quality gain. So, maybe if it was done with a generic preference-based measure, maybe we want it to be disease-specific, to be fine-tuned, a little sharper, a little bit more responsive. But I don't want us to forget that this also can happen outside of utilities, that utilities are one way to inform a value assessment. There are other ways. And that's something Yvette is going to talk about for the rest of our talk, is how other ways patients can engage and patient can inform the value assessment to get to what we really are trying to capture, and that's net health benefit and what matters to patients.
Thank you, Mel. That's fantastic. Go to the next slide, please. So how we approach involving patients in our reviews at ICER is very specific to some of the dynamics of our way of doing health technology assessment. So we try to bring in the patient communities about 6 to 8 weeks before we announce a topic publicly. So we have some lead time to really work with the patient community to understand the different ways in which we want to work with them to get the right insights. Now, the ICER process has 3 really core components to it. The nuts and bolts of it is our evidence-based reviews, which comes out at the end as a very substantial report that includes the clinical evidence review and rating on how strong that evidence is, the economic modeling piece, and the assessment of what the health price benchmark should be. And all of that evidence is then presented at a public deliberative meeting, which is actually a very interesting and exciting part of our process. And if you've never seen one, they're all recorded and available on our website. It's quite interesting to see one of our public meetings take place. And after the public meeting, we then publish what we call the final evidence report and policy recommendations. So one of the unique things about ICER's process and ICER's work is that we don't just issue a final ruling on whether or not a drug should get access. It's much more about providing a review of the evidence and guidelines as to how those new treatments should be adopted and at what price is it deemed to be fair to the healthcare system for those new treatments to be adopted. So it's a little bit more indirect than some HTAs in other countries. Now, the other thing that I think is really interesting about ICER's process from the patient community perspective is that this can be a very powerful advocacy tool. So when we're partnering with patient groups in those early stages, we really want them to understand this is an opportunity for you to highlight the needs of your patient community, the policy priorities, things you need to change in terms of standards of care, where research needs to go for your community and how the research community more broadly should be thinking about your condition. And that's extremely important in rare diseases, particularly rare diseases that are not being well served by big pharmaceutical companies today, and other considerations as well. So it's a very comprehensive way of looking at the patient input piece that goes well beyond just a single measure as well. Next slide. So what are we really trying to learn from patient communities? A lot of it is the lived experience, that direct connection to understanding how you live or care for that individual each and every day. And in knowing that, we want to know about the outliers, but we also want to know what the commonalities are too. So having a very good sense of the diversity of experience and the unique considerations is core to what we're trying to find out. Super important to us is knowing what's most important to people affected by that condition. We know that far too often we're still stuck in the situation in R&D where we're powering trials to meet regulatory criteria, and that sometimes doesn't fully capture the outcomes that are most important to patients. So in rare musculoskeletal diseases, a 6-minute walk test may not be very meaningful to a patient, but waking up in the morning, getting out of bed and being able to walk at all or not be in pain is hugely and massively important. So in HTA, we can look at those patient-centered outcomes and prioritize our judgments of the evidence based on what is important to patients. We have a section in our reports called potential other benefits and contextual considerations. This can include things like the severity of the condition overall. has it been a condition that is underserved generally by the research community? Are there additional considerations in terms of women being able to bear children or return to work, or caregivers having a reduced impact on their day-to-day life that are sometimes difficult to capture, that we don't always have the evidence for, but are still really important in the overall context of value for us to understand and discuss as a part of our process. We find the patient community to be excellent sources of additional evidence. So a lot of our work does rely on the clinical trial data, as Mel mentioned. The utility values we're getting oftentimes comes from what they've gathered in the clinical trials, but there may be other sources of data as well. And we do a very wide review of the evidence. If it exists, we are happy to take a look at it. And then the other piece that's really important for the ICER process is to understand from the patient perspective what those pressure points are in access. Is it the diagnostic journey and just getting to a specialist who can treat you? Is it the utilization management that insurance companies can put in place in the US around having to make patients use different treatments before they find one that works for them? Is it specific provider criteria? That means only a certain type of specialist could be able to prescribe that medicine. So understanding those challenges from the patient perspective is really critical for our review as well. Next slide. And then in terms of opportunities to present or to provide your input, we kind of look at them in terms of 4 key areas. The first one is really just sharing that lived experience. And that can be done either through our open input form, which is available on our website, which is not a validated survey instrument at all, but just an open input form that patients can use to tell us what their experience is. Our process is iterative. So at different stages, we post our work publicly and we take public comments on that. So either as an individual patient or carer, or as an organization, you can respond to our work and tell us what we've missed, what we got right, or what you think we need to do better, or that you know of different sources that may help us quantify something that was said. The public meeting I mentioned previously is a very key opportunity for patient involvement. So throughout the entire day of the meeting, we have 2 patient experts that our independent voting council can call on to give additional perspective and testimony throughout the process. So they'll hear the evidence from the evidence author. They'll see somebody like Mel providing information on the economic modeling, and then they can turn to the patient and go, how does this sit with you? Does this meet with your expectations? And that's a very powerful source of being able to help the voting council understand beyond just the numbers, how do we shift that perception of value higher or lower? And then the last piece, which I again mentioned was a bit unique to the US context, is how can those patient organizations use this evidence beyond the final publication of the report and the policy recommendations to go and advocate for improved standards of care in their community and help achieve the policy change that is needed to ensure patient access to medicine. Next slide. So I just want to highlight there's a couple of really quick ways in which we've seen that the patient community has had a substantial impact on our work. And I'm going to start from the bottom here with multiple sclerosis, because I think it's the closest to what we've really been focused on here today. And this was a review that we did back in 2019, in which the patient community was very clear that the common clinical trial endpoints weren't accurately capturing what was most important to them. So we were able to work with them, field a survey to get additional information to quantify that concern among patients, and then use that data in order to change the ranking of how we looked at the clinical effectiveness of those new agents. So that was really critical to ensuring that the perceptions of value for each of those treatments in that review were weighted a little differently based on that patient perspective versus just what we had seen through the clinical trials. Our sickle cell report was supposed to be the subject of our 2020, early 2020 public meeting. And unfortunately, we never quite got to that final stage because of COVID and all that fun stuff that we have been living through since then. But one of the things that was interesting about the sickle cell community is we knew going into it how underserved and marginalized this patient population was. But some of the anecdotes and qualitative information that we heard from the patient community really made us take some hard looks at the work we were doing and how we were interpreting data and how we were highlighting different things. And so even though we didn't get to that very final stage, what we found is even at the draft stage, because of that description and that qualitative information that was included about the patient experience in our draft report, we saw that payers were taking immediate action to change some of their coverage policies related to some of the symptomatic treatments that patients were facing, because the report was highlighting the problems patients were facing due to systemic racism in the healthcare system. So a really important outcome that we would not have gotten without that input from the patient community, or not as richly, I think, as the patient community. And then more recently, we worked with the lupus nephritis community, another very difficult area where patients are, haven't really had a lot of great treatments to choose from over the years. And the treatments that they do have come with their own problems. So the patient community had been working at the level of the FDA's patient-focused drug development initiative to try to better document the situation that this community was facing. And that had a lot of benefits as manufacturers were taking up trials in this area. So now as it comes down to our point at the HTA level, we actually had a lot of good data that the patient community had gathered over the years in working through that program on what the lifetime impacts of the disease were, particularly on women of childbearing age and their aspirations to become mothers, to have very productive careers, to pursue their educations, and so on and so forth. So based on the feedback that we had from that community, we actually adjusted our model assumptions and also modified the voting questions, which is a modification that has held up in most of our meetings since, to better reflect those considerations that were super important to the patient community. At the end of it, all the stakeholders felt the assessment was fair and balanced. And actually the manufacturer took steps to make sure that their price came within our health price benchmark. So all in all, all the stakeholders were really happy with the end result. And now we're all working together to ensure that the next step from the fair pricing, the fair access, comes through because of all this good input from the patient community as well. Next slide. So here are just some additional resources that you can have to learn more about us. And also my boss would be really happy if I did nothing all day than talk to patient advocates who wanted to learn more about ICER and our process. So if anybody has any questions or wants to have a chat about who we are and what we do and how we do it, my door is virtually always open. I'm based in Boston, so I can do very early my time to accommodate European times, or if you like, I can be up very late at night to accommodate early morning European times as well. But we hope this helps you a bit. We're very grateful for this opportunity and open to all the great discussion to come next.
Guys, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I think it's been really interesting to get that insight, both from Mel to dive a bit more into how these utilities developed, but from Yvette as well to get that really nice feel about what people can gain from actually engaging more with ICER, seeing what your reports are doing, and getting insight into what the work that's happening in HTA and utility assessment in the US. We don't necessarily over here think about that. I think there's a lot that we could gain from engaging more with what you're doing. So thank you for sharing that. I have got a rich collection of questions to dive through. So we're going to try and dive straight in. I've got some logic in my head. I'm going to try and work through a couple of the more maybe functional questions about how you go about the process, and then try and move some bigger picture themes. So let's hang tight and bear with me. If I don't get to your question, guys, huge apologies. We're going to do the best we can. Firstly, I want to just start with a couple that have come in that are looking at the ways you go about looking at the questionnaires. In particular, a question asking how you go about deciding the kind of time range that your question should cover. Do you want to look at questions that are really diving back a long way? Do you look at questions that are looking at a much shorter time horizon? How you ensure the question structure makes that really clear to the people using it. So Jill, I don't know if you want to start with that and maybe pass to John.
Oh, it's a great question, and one I wish I knew a definitive answer for, because as researchers, we're very mixed on our views on this as well. So this is where we get an awful lot of steer from the lived experience. So if we just think about the day, what if someone's filling it in at 8 o'clock in the morning? Maybe they've not had time to experience some of the things that the questions are asking about. If we have the time period too long, are people really able to recall everything? Maybe they might overlook things. So often, sometimes the decision as to the recall period can be quite arbitrary, and they're not really informed. And as instrument developers, we don't tend to report it in the literature. And I'm pleased to say that there's a big turnaround in that, and that we're having to provide a rationale and a justification for every aspect of how we develop these questionnaires now. But for us in our unit, it's really very much driven by what we hear from the people with that lived experience. And an example is we're developing a questionnaire at the moment. We are testing out one component of it, which is indeed the recall period. We're trying out a week, and pretty much everyone we've spoken to is just like, but what if that doesn't happen to me in a week? Why don't you ask it for a month instead? So we had an idea about how we thought it was going to work. We went out, listened to what it is that people were saying, and now we've had a complete rethink. And it's important that we share that learning with the not just the community of people with that health condition, but also the quality of life community to, let's find some evidence to support the decisions that around instrument development across the board.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Jill. Anything to add, John? Are happy with that? Perfect. On a similar kind of vein, on that kind of functional question, you mentioned the need to think about translatability of questions at a certain stage. I mean, given that rare disease and rare population that many of the people listening will be working with, is there a certain threshold you always recommend where you're going to need to get translatability as a priority to get enough answers, or is it really more, about the network you're reaching for your study?
So translatability assessment is really how well those questions work if we try and translate them into another language. But that doesn't mean that the concept means the same thing in another country or indeed in another culture. So in the rare disease space, maybe we should be thinking about multi-country studies in order to be able to develop these questionnaires in the first instance. So that is linked very much to one of the questions that were put in the chat is, we're talking really low numbers for some of these rare diseases. So if there's only say 50 in the UK, maybe we should start thinking about how we go about developing these instruments in the first place and take a much bigger perspective of it. And again, this is where patient advocacy groups can really help researchers and to try and identify different centres and different communities where we can all kind of link in together in order to be able to not just drive the numbers up, but also to think about developing a questionnaire that can be used across the world such that we're not duplicating effort, that we're making sure that the resources are allocated properly in all aspects of research and indeed healthcare decision making.
Brilliant. And I suppose this point harks into another of the questions we've got, which is hinting at the importance of diversity of sampling for the development of the instruments you're looking for, but also the group there. And I'd be interested to get everyone's opinion, because obviously Yvette, you mentioned some of the issues around sickle cell and the importance there of bearing in mind the views of a whole diverse population and structural racism causing problems there. So it'd be interested to see, how do you go about thinking about ensuring that you reach that diverse community in building these questions and actually assessing the outcomes as well?
So in terms of building the questionnaires, that's a really important point for us. So this is something, again, in that development stage, we're working with patient public involvement and patient advocacy groups, where we can kind of find out as researchers are there ways in which we can go about things such that we are ensuring equity in being able to engage with every aspect of the research process? So I touched on that a little bit around people's ability to be able to engage in research outside of, say, core office hours. But of course, there's many other aspects as well, which might be related to ethnicity. So maybe we should be thinking about producing written materials in different languages, but also it's not just about the written word. Maybe we should be thinking more about podcasts to promote and explore diversity issues in order to maximize recruitment, but also to make sure that we have that full spectrum in our samples. Because if we're only talking to people who are available at certain times, or who are of a particular type or a particular characteristic, or can be described in a particular way, then what about everybody else? Because we don't fit in boxes where, you know, the world is a fantastically diverse place, and it's important that our research reflects that as well.
Thanks, Jill. And Yvette or Mel, any thoughts on how that kind of diversity piece plays out in the work that you're doing in ISA?
Yeah, we're increasingly trying to find new ways of finding those voices that aren't kind of naturally reached through the organized patient organizations as well. So we work closely with the patient organizations to find them as well, but we try and also cull through some different resources that are out there and really leverage networks to try to find those as well. We're also looking at beginning to convene a council of advocates that come from those organizations that better represent the underserved voices in our healthcare system, and trying to better understand what we can do to gather more data to input into our process around how new treatments can address the health equity equation. But it's difficult, but it's certainly from the contextual considerations already being looked at in our reports, but I think everybody's really curious to know, is there a better way to measure that? And it's very difficult, but I think we like difficult, and we are looking at it for sure. And Mel, I don't know if you have, from the health economist perspective, some more to share on that.
No, you've answered it perfectly. And, you know, a lot of it goes down to what data you have available. And Michelle has a comment in the Q&A that's a really great point. It's, you know, how could utilities, disutilities be mapped if health-related quality of life are not collected during the trials? And that is a limitation that we face that is almost gut-wrenching, because when there's no data, then it's really hard to incorporate something into our review. Now, do we have steps that we try to get it? Yes. So we might look for a proxy disease. And that's another point where we really rely on our engagements with patients and patient advocacy groups and saying, what's a good proxy disease? Okay, now this is what we found. Does this seem to kind of jive with your experience? Yes, no, that kind of thing. And so it often comes back down to data. And then when we have scarce data, that's just another point where we rely on the folks on this call to help us. What's the next best alternative that we could potentially use, given the dearth of evidence?
Thank you, guys. Okay, a few more questions I want to come to, and our time is ticking away. So someone else is asking the Q&A. Surely if all rare diseases wish to stand an equitable chance of competing amongst other conditions and each other for limited funding, do we not need to develop a more common set of questions that is more suitable for rare diseases than the existing EQ5D? And is that something that's possible? And John, I think you might want to have a comment on this one.
Sure, yeah. I think this is one of the big dilemmas about all this, is while we're developing condition-specific measures, the problem is that we're losing comparability, if you like, with the more common conditions. And in the sense, the problem of HTA agencies is in a sense, they are having to make some sort of comparison across conditions. So there's a number of answers to this. One is to just sort of slavishly use EQ5D or something, which I think probably many people would think is a wrong approach. Another could be to develop a new generic measure, which is much better at taking account of some of these sort of broader issues, other aspects of that affect common conditions. And I'm afraid I have to mention it, but we've been working with the Oracle group on a new measure called the EQ-HWB, which is the EQ Health and Wellbeing Scale, which is designed to which is designed to be much broader. I'm not saying it covers everything, but it's broader, and it covers things like autonomy and identity, energy and cognition, those things that are all excluded from EQ5D. It's still at an experimental stage, it's still being developed, but we hope in 2 or 3 years' time that it will very much be available. And at least for some conditions, some rare conditions, it may be, an answer. It may help because it's an instrument that will be suitable for most common conditions and also hopefully a lot of rare conditions. But I have to say, when we built the measure, I have to be honest, we took the 18 most common conditions and looked at the qualitative evidence on those, because that's what you do, So I'm very conscious that it probably won't cover all the bases. And I agree with the general sentiment here that probably what we need to do is get a better a feeling for across rare conditions. What is it? What are the gaps? Because we're not going to be able to answer it by continually developing new questionnaires for every condition. I just don't think that's going to be feasible, particularly for the ultra-rare. And we do need to think about some other answers to the problem. And Mel mentioned about working with advocacy groups to try and get an understanding of another condition, which is like, and then using an instrument there. But it might also be worth just trying to tease out a bit more what sort of domains are coming out, and are they different from the ones we typically get from common conditions, which we found in our EQHWB work.
Thank you for that.
I'd just like to, if I could make a quick comment too, because, also what is so interesting to me, and the perspective that I've always worked in and come from when I listen to this discussion is it's kind of a very focused topic, a very specific topic, but it highlights the difficulty of what we're trying to do with HTA overall, which is really understand the trade-offs. Like, we as a society, not just as individual patients, but as a society, do we really believe that we should spend so much money on Alzheimer's treatments that have a very questionable benefit, that we have no money left over for this rare condition that treats 80 people in the UK with a drug that is, a gene therapy that costs $2 million, but essentially cures those patients. So really weighing up those trade-offs is very, very difficult and very, very hard for us at a society level. When you bring it down to the patient level, it's even more gut-wrenching, because as that rare disease advocate or as that Alzheimer's advocate, you are faced with that choice of wanting what you need for your condition and for your family. And so there is that tension in the system. And that's why, this overall discussion of like, how do we really measure value is so important. And what these instruments are trying to do is trying to give us, a consistent way of weighing up people's perceptions of value so that we can better make rational decisions. But that is an imperfect science. And that's why this work is fascinating.
Thank you. It's a really nice way to kind of sum things up and highlight the challenge of this and the reason that it's so important for patient groups to engage with it, and for all of us to continue asking these questions and trying to tackle difficult issues. Time has run away from us. Apologies to those of you whose questions we haven't been able to address, but thank you so much for your engagement. It's been great to see such interaction, Q&A and the chat, and fantastic answers from all the panelists. And I hope you agree with me that it's been a really fascinating and interesting presentation from all. And I'm sure we'd like to chat to you more in the future about some of these questions. I've got a list of my own I haven't been able to ask, and I'll surely engage with you on those later. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to quickly share a couple of things that are coming up from us, because I have a captive audience and you should always know what we're doing. Upcoming from Findacure next week, in fact, we're having a rare chat session, a chance for you to talk amongst yourselves and with us about patient experiences in research and trial design. What have you been doing out there in the community to try and engage with this, to move your research area forward? It's a chance to learn from each other, share experiences, and to help us think about how we can develop more training to help you in what you're doing in the future. So please, if you're interested, check out our news page and sign up for that. We're also currently at the stage of being ready to launch our annual Student Voice Prize in collaboration with Healx Rare Diseases. It's a chance for patient groups to be paired with a young student medic and tell them about your individual or your patient group's experience of rare conditions, to help them write an essay to reflect the impact of rare diseases on patients and to understand the role that clinicians can play in the future. It's a great project, and so if you'd like to be paired with a medic, please do check out our website and put an application in today. You have that chance that a young student might want to talk to you for an hour and hear about your condition, which is never a bad thing, I'm sure you'll agree. And finally, we try and do these webinars as much as we can. We want to make them better for you, so let us know what was good, what was bad. Fill in that survey, which will follow from this, and that gives us the best chance to put on more effective and better events for you in the future. That is the end from me and then for our panelists. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you to all our speakers, and we'll see you again soon. Any questions, drop us a message at the project's email address. Thank you so much and have a lovely evening. Thanks all, goodbye.
Thank you.